The neighborhood of Pelican Shores had always prided itself on uniformity, and not the healthy, well-maintained kind rooted in peaceful coexistence, but rather the polished veneer of perfection enforced by a board of homeowners who had long since forgotten that actual humans lived behind the stucco and symmetry. On paper, the promotional brochure described Pelican Shores as an idyllic lakeside community with upscale families, responsible neighbors, and unparalleled community standards. In person, it was better described as a place where lawn heights, mailbox colors, and window tint percentages mattered more than personal liberty, and where the HOA president's clipboard held more authority than the local sheriff. The house at the edge of the cul-de-sac, though, didn't look out of place. Its hedges were trimmed, driveway pressure-washed, shutters freshly repainted, and porch lanterns spotless. There was nothing rebellious or disorderly about it. Nothing except for the one object that would soon be the catalyst for a battle none of the board members were prepared for. A 32-foot Boston Whaler, freshly waxed dual outboard engines, official insignia covered by a roll-down tarp, sitting elevated on a transport trailer engineered for long-haul deployment. To most passers-by, it looked like a high-end offshore fishing vessel. To someone less charitable, it was an intrusion upon the visual continuity of the neighborhood aesthetic. And to one person, one particular self-appointed guardian of imagined order, it was a personal affront worthy of intervention. That person was Marcia Darrington, the HOA president, volunteer neighborhood safety coordinator, and full-time professional nuisance. She had lived in Pelican Shores long enough to consider herself part of its architectural DNA. She carried herself as though the entire subdivision required her approval before even the weather could change. And so the moment she spotted the unfamiliar boat sitting in the driveway, towering above sedans and landscaping, gleaming and impossible to ignore, she felt the familiar heat of righteous indignation bubbling behind her polite but brittle smile. There was no sound that irritated her more than the metallic groan of a trailer hitch locking into place. She believed boats belonged either at marinas or inside storage units, not within view of law-abiding homeowners. Never mind that the street quite literally bordered a large navigable waterway, or that the majority of homes had docks built into the property line. What mattered to Marcia wasn't water access but order, and in her mind, order meant she decides, others comply. She stood across the sidewalk during her morning walk-through, a thinly disguised patrol for infractions, and adjusted her sunglasses with the practiced poise of someone who was already drafting a violation notice in her head. The neighbors nearby, already accustomed to her presence as though she were a human surveillance camera, ducked behind hedges and car doors, preferring to avoid eye contact and whatever lecture she might be manufacturing. The lone exception was the couple in the next driveway quietly watering their hibiscuses, pretending not to notice her. But she did not yet know they were only witnessing the calm before a future storm. The boat itself sat immaculately covered, secured, and clearly new. Its hull was state-issued, professionally maintained, and built for conditions far more serious than a Sunday lake outing. The thick steel tie-down brackets, radar mounts, and reinforced deck were not typical of recreational crafts. Had Marcia known the purpose of those features, she might have reconsidered her crusade before firing the first shot. But she did not know, and more importantly, she did not care. She had already made up her mind. The boat would not stay. As she paced in front of the house, snapping photos from 3 separate angles like an eager private investigator, her internal monologue was already escalating the imagined infraction to cinematic proportions. It was unsightly, unapproved, unauthorized, and probably unlicensed. It didn't matter that she had no jurisdiction to determine such things. In her eyes, it was not only a violation of what she believed the HOA rules should say. It was a symbolic challenge to her authority, and challenges could not be tolerated. A resident across the street stepped out to retrieve a package and quickly retreated inside the moment he saw her squinting and documenting the boat. He knew the pattern. Something had triggered her, and soon printed letters would begin appearing taped to front doors, the way thunderstorms followed humidity. The neighborhood group chat would light up with thinly veiled remarks. about certain homeowners disregarding standards, and minor inconveniences would be repackaged as existential threats to community value. And yet, beneath all her posturing, Marcia did not realize that this time she wasn't dealing with a timid retiree or a passive young couple afraid of confrontation. This homeowner was someone accustomed to far more than aggressive citations and suburban intimidation. This was someone who spent his professional life issuing orders, not receiving them. Someone whose name, if she had bothered to look up the property records before waging war, carried authority beyond anything she could ever muster through an HOA handbook. For the moment, however, she remained happily uninformed. She lifted her chin, tightened her lips, and whispered a phrase she'd uttered countless times before, as though it were a personal oath. "Not in my neighborhood." And with that, she marched home to prepare the paperwork. What made her most confident in her crusade was her assumption, one she had been rewarded for in the past, that most homeowners would cave immediately at the first hint of confrontation. She enjoyed the image of the boat being hastily removed by someone intimidated by her title. She assumed a fear response before she even delivered the notice. In her mind, she had already won. But across town, the boat's owner was finishing the last day of a scheduled deployment rotation and would soon return home. He had spent his morning reviewing security briefings, maritime activity reports, and federal enforcement updates. Not exactly the resume of someone likely to buckle when presented with an HOA citation. He had commanded storm rescues, coordinated interdictions in hostile waters, managed live operations under pressure most civilians would never comprehend. And unbeknownst to her, the boat she loathed so passionately had federal jurisdiction attached to it in more ways than one. The engine mounts she found ugly were military-grade. The radar mast she believed unpermitted was government-issued, and the insignia concealed under the tarp identified the craft not as a pleasure boat, but as an operational U.S. Coast Guard rapid response vessel temporarily docked off-duty in the driveway of the man responsible for its deployment. By the time he returned later that evening, the letter would already be printed, sealed, and waiting. And by the end of the week the HOA would learn, far more abruptly than it was prepared for, that its authority did not outrank federal command. For now, though, everything remained quiet. The street still looked postcard perfect. The water beyond the docks glimmered lazily beneath the heat of midday sun. The boat remained parked and silent, like a coiled spring awaiting motion. But underneath the calm, the collision course was already set, and the first notice was already on its way. The notice arrived before sunrise, just as predictably as the dew settling across manicured lawns, slipped not so subtly halfway into the front door jamb. Its placement was strategic and theatrical, the kind of positioning chosen by someone who wanted the entire neighborhood to see that a supposed offender had been marked. Most residents in Pelican Shores had learned to anticipate the arrival of such slips the same way people in other regions anticipated storm sirens, not with surprise, but with resigned dread. For most, these letters meant compliance, apology, or defeat. For the homeowner of the boat in the driveway, it meant something very different. It was still dark when return headlights swept across the cul-de-sac, announcing the arrival of the boat's owner, a measured, alert figure accustomed to late hours and unpredictable schedules. His uniform remained out of sight, stored in the vehicle rather than worn, but his posture and manner carried the unmistakable air of someone accustomed to command. The quiet stillness of the street offered no immediate hint of the battle soon to unfold, yet the foundation for it had already been laid, in a single envelope taped in smug defiance to his door inside the HOA office, a converted guest room in Marcia's home, outfitted with laminated posters about community, standards, and an over-decorated credenza that served as her personal proclamation stand. The violation report had already been documented. She had filed it with a sense of accomplishment, logging the boat as an unauthorized exterior obstruction and categorizing it into 3 different sub-violations she had invented through liberal interpretation of the bylaws. She had even typed out a second notice in advance, confidently anticipating that the first would go unanswered and escalate her involvement. Power, to her, was a ritual. She enjoyed the sequence of pressure, escalation, and submission. And historically, it worked, because most homeowners were weary, uninformed, or simply uninterested in skirmishes with someone who had endless energy for conflict. But the man she targeted lived his entire professional life inside hierarchies where the chain of authority was not implied but codified and enforced through federal statute, a setting where earned rank, not self-appointed titles, dictated consequence. By sunrise, he had read the notice in its entirety. Its tone was scolding and ceremonial, written in the verbose style preferred by people who mistake verbosity for legitimacy. It claimed the boat violated storage placement rules, obstructed community visual symmetry, and constituted an unregistered maritime vehicle visible from the street. The last line alone was evidence that Marcia had little idea what she was dealing with. The irony, naturally, was that the vessel was not merely registered, it was federally commissioned. From a legal standpoint, Marcia's reach ended at the curb. From a practical standpoint, she had just waded into waters deeper than she understood. The remainder of the morning unfolded normally for the rest of the neighborhood. Joggers passed by in curated athletic wear, pretending not to slow down as they glanced curiously at the covered vessel. Trash trucks made their rounds. Sprinklers whispered across identical lawns. And somewhere at the other end of the subdivision, Marcia was already composing a board update she fully intended to read aloud at the next HOA meeting, an announcement of her intervention before she had even received a response. To her, this was another easy victory in progress. But the opposition she now faced was not reactionary. It was procedural, methodical, quiet. The homeowner did not storm across the street or peel the notice apart in dramatics. He did not pace or curse or issue threats. He documented the letter, photographed it for record, then retrieved a thick binder of federal maritime statute and local easement law, materials far more enforceable than the selectively interpreted photocopied handbook Marcia relied on. He already knew the boundaries of HOA jurisdiction. His vessel, even parked in a civilian neighborhood, remained government property under Title 14 protections. That fact alone meant the HOA had unintentionally stepped into federal operational territory. Yet he said nothing. Not yet. For now, he watched. As the day moved forward, the neighborhood grapevine began its predictable murmuring. Residents knew the pattern. Marcia's tone had been borderline triumphant during her morning lap, which meant she had found something to crusade against. Some neighbors were quietly thrilled. Finally, someone might challenge her. Others braced themselves, knowing that once she chose a target, she rarely retreated unless forced, and force would indeed be required. That afternoon, she crafted the next steps like a tactical campaign. A courtesy follow-up inspection, a prepared fine schedule, a notice of non-compliance already printed but undated, and an entry on the board agenda to request legal escalation. Everything about her behavior indicated a woman certain her authority would be respected. She did not question her own certainty, not because she was correct, but because she had never before encountered someone who refused to cower. Meanwhile, the homeowner reviewed maritime jurisdiction case law with the ease of someone rehearsing familiar doctrine. He cross-referenced federal preemption statutes, operational confidentiality rules, and protections related to military vessels temporarily moored or transported for service use. There was nothing ambiguous. The HOA had no standing to regulate its placement, nor the authority to compel removal. In fact, her attempt to regulate it bordered on unlawful interference with federal asset deployment. She believed she was enforcing neighborhood tranquility. In reality, she was tampering with federal property. The storm had not yet begun its first peal of thunder, but the clouds were already gathering. Every page she prepared, every additional warning she pre-wrote, every ounce of smug momentum she built was merely tightening the slingshot of consequences, waiting to snap back. She saw a stationary boat blocking. Her view of architectural conformity, he saw a federal vessel performing lawful stand-down positioning after active deployment. 2. Interpretations, but only one held the weight of statute behind it. And within 48 hours, Her crusade would escalate from petty annoyance to legal exposure she could no longer control. Because the HOA president had not merely picked the wrong battle, she had picked the wrong commander. By the second day, the situation had evolved from a minor irritation in Marcia's mind into a full-scale personal crusade. She carried herself with the brisk, self-important stride of someone who believed she was not just enforcing rules, but defending civilization from creeping disorder. She told herself that if she ignored this violation, others would follow. First a boat, then extra street parking, then unapproved exterior lighting, then the collapse of the atmosphere of quality she believed she alone preserved. She saw herself as a sentinel at the gates of neighborhood purity, the last bulwark against decline. And in her mind, decline usually looked like a neighbor not asking her permission. She typed her escalation email with the zeal of a judge issuing a sentence. Formal notice of noncompliance, second warning drafted and queued, and a threat of fines she fully expected to collect. She copied all board members and marked the email urgent, as though a covered vessel quietly sitting in a driveway was a danger in motion. She referenced vague bylaws and selectively quoted past interpretations, as though precedent and legal authority were the same thing. Then she hit send and sat back with the satisfied calm of someone who believed she had exercised civic heroism. What she did not realize was that this second warning, prematurely prepared and time-stamped before any grace window had expired, would become her undoing. She was in such a hurry to display authority that she never paused to consider whether she had it. Meanwhile, the homeowner remained deliberately silent. He understood escalation patterns far beyond suburban politics. Patience was strategy, and premature confrontation was an advantage forfeited. A quiet adversary is one that gathers leverage, and leverage in his world was structural, not emotional. He knew something else Marcia did not. HOA boards were just as bound by procedural legality as the residents they claimed to regulate. Her premature notice wasn't merely rude. It was an official misstep. Filing an escalation before the expiration of a mandated response window meant she had violated her own governing charter. By acting outside procedure, she had already opened a path through which her authority could be challenged and potentially dissolved. She didn't know she had stepped into a trap, but the moment the timestamp printed, the door closed behind her. The neighbors began noticing tiny cracks in the facade of her control. They watched her circle the cul-de-sac twice more throughout the day, hovering near the driveway as though expecting the vessel to vanish out of shame. Instead, it remained, still secured, still immaculate, and still covered by the heavy-duty tarp shielding its insignia. The absence of movement made her uneasy. She was used to visible compliance, the kind that validated her sense of power. Silence, especially from someone she expected to fold, was foreign to her. She interpreted the stillness as defiance. He interpreted it as stage setting. By the afternoon of the third day, she had convinced herself she needed reinforcements. She announced to the rest of the board that she would be contacting city code enforcement. She relished the idea of bringing in higher authority, without realizing that she was unknowingly walking jurisdictionally uphill, toward an entity she could neither outrank nor corral. When she made the call, she exaggerated the issue. The boat she claimed was oversized, improperly stored, and likely unregistered. She threw in speculation about safety hazards, property value erosion, and non-compliance with visual easements. She peppered her argument with dramatic phrasing and half-informed legal claims, the kind favored by people who believe confidence itself constitutes factual foundation, but what she actually accomplished was prompting city officials to check ownership and classification. The moment they ran the identification tag concealed beneath the tarp, the entire tone of the conversation shifted internally. What she thought would produce reinforcements had instead triggered federal recognition. The city made no immediate move because they could not. What she thought was a civil infraction was, in reality, a federal asset on temporary standby, protected under maritime jurisdiction. And that, in quiet administrative language, is where her escalation died. But Marcia was not yet aware of that death. She was still waiting for a return call she assumed would bring validation. She believed confirmation was forthcoming. She believed she would soon parade the enforcement as proof that her governance was not merely ceremonial. The silence that followed from the city did not read to her as refusal. She interpreted it as bureaucracy, not futility. Meanwhile, word spread through the neighborhood in whispers not driven by fear, but by curiosity. Some began to wonder who the new homeowner really was. Others guessed, correctly, that anyone who could afford and operate a vessel of that classification likely wasn't deterred by HOA theatrics. A few quietly hoped this new resident might be the one to finally rein in Marcia, or at least puncture her air of untouchable authority. The stage by now was perfect. She had issued the first warning. She had prepared the second prematurely. She had contacted the city. She had potentially triggered a jurisdictional review she did not understand. And she had done all of this without once speaking to the homeowner directly. Now, all that remained was the inevitable collision between the image of power she believed she held and the reality of the authority she had accidentally challenged. The board members began receiving tentative replies from the city, requests for clarification, oddly neutral phrasing, and language that hinted at complications they did not understand. One member privately grew nervous, sensing a miscalculation. Another wondered aloud if perhaps more information about the boat was needed before escalation. But Marcia dismissed all hesitation as weakness. Authority, in her view, was enforced by posture, not facts. And yet the facts were already aligning against her. She had not merely attempted to regulate a resident. She was now, unknowingly, attempting to regulate the United States Coast Guard. The next notification she would receive would not be the validation she expected, but the first sign that her power had limits, limits she was about to collide with head-on. The fourth day began with a tension the neighborhood could not quite identify, but could feel. There was no confrontation on the lawn, no shouting match, no spectacle to witness, and yet something in the air had shifted. The stillness had gone from passive to anticipatory, like the atmosphere in the seconds before thunder rolls across open water. The boat remained anchored in its place, immovable, silent, and utterly unbothered by the storm that had been forming around it. Its presence had become less a matter of curiosity and more a matter of suspense. Marcia woke before sunrise, convinced that this would be the day she gained external confirmation of her authority. In her imagination, the city would arrive, demand the vessel's removal, and congratulate her for maintaining standards. She rehearsed how she might recount her success at the next board meeting, picturing nods of admiration from those who typically only half listened to her. She wanted acknowledgement, not for service but for supremacy. She viewed leadership not as stewardship, but as control. She brewed her morning coffee with the triumphant calm of someone who believes victory is already in motion. But miles away, city compliance staff were drafting a very different sort of message, one that would travel slowly through administrative channels, gathering layers of caution and legal distance before it ever reached her hands. The internal notes on the enforcement ticket had already red-flagged the vessel as a federal asset, not recreational, not privately registered in the sense she assumed, not subject to neighborhood-level restriction. It existed beneath a jurisdictional umbrella that local code enforcement had neither the authority nor the confidence to challenge. The file now required federal oversight and departmental contact. That alone meant the city could not touch it without exposing itself to a jurisdictional overreach. This was not a property nuisance. It was government equipment on temporary operational standby. Marcia, unaware of that pivot, spent the morning drafting what she believed would be her final warning. Her language was sharper now, less procedural and more punitive. She believed she was closing in on her target, tightening a noose of compliance. Instead, she was documenting, on record, an escalating attempt to pressure federal personnel over federal property. By mid-morning, she dressed in her HOA blazer, the one she wore during board meetings for the purpose of appearing official. It was less an outfit and more a costume, symbolic armor for someone who relied on visual theatrics to signal power. She took a slow, satisfied walk through the cul-de-sac again, mentally narrating to herself the enforcement she believed she was orchestrating. She watched the boat like a hawk circling prey, unaware that she herself was the one in the crosshairs of her own hubris. Inside the home she was watching, however, the preparation was meticulous. The homeowner remained calm, not because he was disengaged, but because he understood an adversary best defeated through demonstration, not debate. His quiet was not surrender but timing. He had already printed and compiled the statute packets. He had already logged her violation of HOA charter procedure. He had already documented the premature scheduling of fines. He had already prepared the section of the HOA's own bylaws that would secure his grievance and establish her misconduct on record. He wasn't merely preparing to defend himself. He was preparing to hold her accountable. And the difference between those two positions was the difference between resistance and authority. Around noon, the first email from the city finally reached the HOA mailbox. The subject line was uneventful. The contents were anything but. The tone was hesitant, diplomatic, and almost alarmingly careful. A tone that read less like cooperation and more like liability avoidance. It did not confirm a violation. It did not support her assumption. Instead, it suggested that the board pause all enforcement actions until property classification clarification was complete. Marcia read it, not understanding what she was looking at. She interpreted the heavily coded caution as mere bureaucratic delay. She assumed the city was gathering support, not retreating from risk. She did not understand that government officials choose their wording with precision when gently signaling to someone that they are out of their depth. She responded immediately, pressing for confirmation, insisting this was a simple compliance matter, reiterating her supposed authority. It was the written equivalent of tugging every lever in a cockpit without reading a single instrument, and that was when the tone shifted from quiet hesitation to departmental shielding. Her second reply triggered escalation, not on the homeowner, but on her. The city's legal desk flagged the file. When a resident interferes with federal operational property, the issue does not travel down the chain of command. It travels up. By late afternoon, the city had paused the matter entirely and forwarded jurisdictional inquiry to the Coast Guard contact office, unknowingly, notifying the very branch commanded by the resident. She had been threatening with fines. She had thrown her net forward without checking what waters she was sailing into and what waited beneath. Her was not a homeowner to intimidate. It was command authority. The silence that followed was no longer passive. It was tactical. She mistook it for delay. The city knew it as withdrawal, and the homeowner knew it as the moment just before consequences turn visible. From the outside, nothing had changed. The street still looked impeccably calm. The humidity hung low over the water. The world carried on as though nothing were brewing. But a shift in power had already occurred. What had begun as a petty campaign had crossed thresholds of jurisdiction she did not comprehend. And soon she would no longer be the one issuing notices. She still believed she would be the person delivering consequences. She had not realized she was about to be on the receiving end of them. The fifth day would not bring the enforcement she expected. It would bring the revelation she never saw coming. The fifth day began with a subtle but undeniable shift in the air, an atmosphere of expectation rather than conflict. The neighborhood had grown increasingly aware that something unusual was unfolding, though no one had yet witnessed a dramatic turn. What they sensed was pressure, like a storm front building just offshore, hidden from view but impossible to ignore. Even those who had long ago tuned out HOA theatrics now found themselves watching the quiet standoff with cautious curiosity. The boat remained exactly where it had been since its arrival, covered, secured, unmoved, and exuding the silent authority of something that did not answer to neighborhood rules. The lack of reaction was unnerving to Marcia in ways she could not articulate. She lived on feedback, visible submission, apologies, forced gestures of compliance. But the stillness gave her nothing. And people who rely on control do not tolerate silence well, because silence is not surrender. Silence is strategy. That morning, the city's second reply arrived. Short, concise, and legally insulated. It was not what she wanted, and not what she understood. It repeated the instruction to pause all enforcement, further stating that the matter involves classification review. The phrasing was careful, the sort of language chosen when officials fear overstepping. But rather than reading caution, she read inconvenience. She believed the city was dragging its feet. She did not understand that she herself had become the subject of procedural review, not the homeowner. The Coast Guard liaison received the forwarded jurisdictional inquiry within the hour. Standard protocol prompted the system to flag the asset ID associated with the vessel, an automatic verification that tied the craft to its commanding officer. The notification that followed did not disappear into bureaucratic backlog. It traveled straight into the correct chain of command. And the chain of command, in this case, led directly back to the cul-de-sac. By mid-morning, steps were already underway that would pull the matter out of civilian governance entirely. Documentation was drafted, agency clarification letters were prepared. The HOA was not merely being deprived of jurisdiction. It was about to be formally informed that it had none. Unaware of how swiftly the tide was turning, Marcia spent that same morning preparing a spectacle. She had decided she would perform her final inspection, believing she was closing in on victory. She printed copies of the bylaw she routinely weaponized, unaware that the bylaw did not apply to government equipment, and that even if it had, she had already nullified her own authority by violating procedural timelines. She set out across the street with the purposeful march of someone expecting to deliver humiliation. But she was not approaching a confrontation. She was walking directly into exposure. The homeowner had been waiting for this precise moment, though not with hostility, only with inevitability. He had allowed her enough rope to demonstrate on record every misstep, enough evidence to show selective enforcement, enough proof to show misconduct as defined by her own governing charter, enough documentation to show she had attempted to interfere with federal property. She had built her own case, just not the one she thought she was building. She approached the driveway expecting to observe the boat again, to photograph it again, to fabricate another infraction from repetition and stubborn certainty. But what she witnessed instead was something she was wholly unprepared for, evidence of a chain of authority far above her own. The tarp, which she had grown accustomed to seeing, was no longer fully drawn, not removed, merely folded back far enough to reveal what she had never considered: insignia. Not decorative, not recreational, not civilian. Federal. There are moments in which a person realizes, abruptly, that they have stepped outside their depth so completely that there is no graceful way to retreat. Her face did not betray panic, only a delayed, stunned recalibration. The kind of realization that begins, not as fear, but as cognition collapsing beneath the weight of fact. She had not reported a nuisance. She had reported a United States military vessel. She had not attempted to regulate a neighbor. She had attempted to regulate a federal commander. It was in that instant, not from confrontation, but from clarity, that her self-appointed authority cracked. The story she had told herself about righteous enforcement evaporated, replaced by the dawning knowledge that she had escalated into a world where her title meant nothing. Her citations had no legal standing, and her continued interference risked something she had never confronted before: consequences for her. The city's next notice arrived shortly thereafter. This time not gently phrased, not apologetic, not cautious. It stated, in formal language, that the matter had been referred to federal jurisdiction, and that the HOA was to cease further contact, review, or enforcement immediately. It was the administrative equivalent of a door slamming shut. The jurisdictional gulf between local oversight and federal asset control was now undeniable. But the city's letter was only the prelude. The Coast Guard was preparing its own. By late afternoon, the Homeowners Association Board had been pulled into emergency discussion, not to reinforce Marcia's actions, but to salvage liability. Her fellow board members, those who once yielded to her ferocity out of habit, now found themselves side-eyeing her ambition as a threat rather than an asset. They faced exposure. They faced reprimand. They faced legal review of selective enforcement practices and evidence she had acted unilaterally without procedure. She had not merely overstepped, she had placed the entire board in legal jeopardy. Some began distancing themselves immediately. Others scrambled to understand what protections, if any, existed for them if federal involvement escalated. None had anticipated that a covered boat could become a jurisdictional noose laced with consequences. And outside, in the driveway, she had surveilled with fixation. The vessel sat unchanged, proof not of disobedience, but of rank. The neighbors watched. The board panicked quietly. The city stepped back. The jurisdiction shifted upward. And Marcia, once certain she was the force of order in the neighborhood, found herself abruptly powerless, stripped not by confrontation, but by revelation. The sixth day would not be about silence. The sixth day would be about consequences, and for the first time in her tenure, she would not be the one issuing them. By the sixth day, the tone of the neighborhood had transformed completely. The curiosity of the earlier days had ripened into something closer to anticipation, as though everyone sensed an unveiling was imminent. Word spread quietly, not through gossip, but through the unmistakable shift in posture from the HOA board itself. The usual air of smug governance had dissolved into restraint, caution, and whispered uncertainty. No one had publicly announced what was happening, yet instinctively, the residents could tell the balance of power had shifted. The boat remained in its position at the end of the driveway, now partially uncovered, the insignia visible enough to confirm what had previously been only speculation. An official Coast Guard vessel on active federal register. The kind of equipment not merely owned, but commanded. And where HOA boards rule through bylaws, federal command exists through statute. Statute outranks preference. Jurisdiction outranks ego. Marcia, for the first time since the start of the ordeal, was no longer patrolling the neighborhood. She was indoors, frantically drafting a narrative she might use to frame the situation as a misunderstanding, though she herself had not yet accepted what had occurred. The fear that had begun as unease had calcified into something heavier. The dawning knowledge that she had miscalculated not just the resident, but the scale of the authority behind him. In her mind, she was still rehearsing rescue attempts for her reputation. But reputations are not rescued by rewriting history. They are determined by what has already been recorded, and she had left a trail wide enough to drive a federal cutter through. That morning, an official packet arrived at the HOA address, sealed, formal, and direct. It was not from the city. It was not from county enforcement. It was not from a local administrative office seeking cooperative resolution. It carried a federal crest. Inside was not merely clarification, but correction. A written directive establishing that the vessel was a Coast Guard craft under federal jurisdiction, not subject to HOA regulation under any conditions. It articulated that attempts to interfere with or dictate placement of such federal equipment constituted obstruction, an offense far more serious than a bylaw dispute. The letter did not threaten. It did not posture. It simply stated fact. Fact that carried weight beyond interpretation. The HOA board convened within the hour, shaken by what they read. Not only were they instructed to cease further action, they were required to acknowledge, formally and on the record, that their board president had acted outside the scope of her authority, risking unlawful interference. The directive did not specifically name consequences because it did not need to. Consequences were implied in the mere existence of jurisdictional notice. It was no longer a matter of whether Marcia had overstepped. It was a matter of what would be done about it. The board, stripped of her domineering presence for the first time, saw the situation with clarity. Her pattern of excess control had always caused friction, but this was the first time her behavior produced risk beyond annoyance. It was no longer about petty enforcement. It was about liability, and liability has a way of refocusing even the most complacent administrators. The homeowner did not need to attend their meeting. He did not need to argue. His authority required no spectacle. It had already spoken through documentation, jurisdiction, and unshakable chain of command. The same quiet restraint he exhibited all week now read not as silence, but mastery. He had never once been defensive, because he had never needed to defend anything. Federal jurisdiction is not defended. It is recognized. By afternoon, a secondary packet had been prepared, this one originating not from government, but from the HOA itself, a formal letter of withdrawal signed by the board, acknowledging error and rescinding all violation notices. The language was careful, clearly vetted by someone now aware of how close the HOA had come to legal jeopardy. The letter was delivered not through intimidation, but through obligation. And attached to it, almost as an afterthought, was something far more significant. Notice of board leadership audit and correction. In plain terms, a polite prelude to Marcia's removal. Only then, after consequences could no longer be delayed or reframed, did she attempt to salvage control. But people who rule through coercion rarely retain loyalty when their power fractures. The board she once directed no longer stood behind her. The shield she believed she controlled had dropped, revealing not a leader under pressure, but a liability finally exposed. Her attempt to present the matter as a misunderstanding was too little, too late. The timeline spoke for itself. The premature warnings, the second notice before the first window closed, the city contacts, the attempt to escalate beyond her role, the continued pursuit even after cautionary replies. She had not misunderstood. She had trespassed into jurisdiction she never possessed. What she mistook for governance had been ego. What she mistook for leadership had been theater. What she mistook for victory had been the threshold of her fall. By early evening, the resolution was complete. The board moved to strip her of authority pending review. She was no longer president, no longer holding the illusion of unchecked oversight. The very rules she once wielded had become the instrument of her removal. The bylaws she used as weapons now served as testimony against her. The neighborhood watched her retreat, not publicly disgraced, but unmistakably dethroned. And as quickly as she vanished from patrol, a strange sense of relief swept the cul-de-sac. Without fear of surveillance, the street felt open again. The quiet was no longer tense, it was peaceful. The vessel remained in the driveway, not as provocation, not as trophy, but as lawful presence. A reminder that power is not volume. Power is not posture. Power is not intimidation. Power is legitimacy. And legitimacy had never been hers. In the days that followed, she would attempt to rebuild her image in smaller ways, first through excuses, then through isolation. But reputations do not recover from revelation. People had finally seen her without the costume of authority. The neighborhood did not expand in chaos after her fall. Lawns remained trimmed, driveways remained orderly. Life carried on as it always had, proof that she had never preserved anything. The community did not require control. It merely required relief from it. The boat would eventually return to active deployment, just as quietly as it had arrived. And when it did, the street would not lose order. It would simply lose the symbol of what had undone misplaced power. In the end, the HOA did not defeat the commander. The commander defeated the myth that she had ever been in command at all.